Hello and welcome to the Kroll Lens, our podcast navigating the regulatory landscape, part of our series with Kroll's experts to help you navigate the evolving regulatory environment. As an award-winning provider of compliance and regulatory consulting services to the financial services industry, Kroll helps clients develop, implement, and manage their compliance and regulatory consulting programs. In today's episode, Kroll's Matt Austen and Paul Heffernan examine the role of the three lines of defense function at regulated firms in helping the FCA achieve the key aims of the consumer duty.
Hello and welcome to this Kroll Lens discussion, a series of technical insights focusing on the approaching consumer duty and its impact on regulated firms. I am Matt Austen, Senior Vice President in the UK Regulatory Consulting Team, and I will be your usual host. Today we will look at the role of third line of defence function at regulated firms, whether that be internal audit or an outsourced independent specialist, in helping to prepare for the consumer duty. The FCA has been clear that the consumer duty will touch on all elements of firms' businesses where there is a retail customer at the end of the process, and the third line of defence has a key role to play to provide the board and senior management with assurance over the coming months and years. Today I'm pleased to be joined by a resident SME on all things third line, Paul Heffernan. Good morning, Paul. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Matt. Welcome.
Thank you. Paul is a director in the UK Regulatory Consulting Team, bringing with him around 15 years' experience in the field of internal audit, split between consulting roles and senior internal audit and operational risk positions within major UK banks. We'll start our discussion by looking at the role of the third line of defence in supporting the board. So we've seen the FCA being very clear in the consumer duty final policy that it expects the firm's governing body, and by that I essentially mean the board, which is what it will be in most firms. Certainly refer to the board as we go on. They expect the board to take ultimate responsibility for the firm's successful implementation of the consumer duty and, after this has taken place, ongoing oversight of the delivery of good customer outcomes. Steps taken in this regard already include requiring a board scrutinised and approved implementation plan, the deadline for which was the end of October this year, and we've just seen in the past month the feedback from that come from the FCA. Another point is the FCA will expect governing bodies to commission an annual report on the extent of compliance with the consumer duty and where good or poor outcomes are evident. So the first board report will need to be finalised within 12 months of the rules coming into effect. So for most firms, that will be the end of July 2024. So the first question, Paul, if I can pick your brains on, I think it would be good to get your view on perhaps you tell us a bit more about the role you see the third line of defence playing in supporting the board with its implementation of the consumer duty and the eventual annual attestation that will be required from the governing body to confirm that good outcomes are being achieved.
Yeah, sure. I mean, fundamentally, the fact that there is so much emphasis given on the board taking responsibility, I mean, that should be apparent for any major risk or operation of an organisation, that the board bear that responsibility. But it's notable that the FCA have been very clear on that. You know, the sign off of the initial plans back in October, and then the ongoing attestation, really sort of emphasises that fact. And therefore, the role of third line of defence, whether that's an in-house function or an external provider providing those third line of defence services, the fundamental nature of independent third line assurance is it is reporting directly to the board. So that's what makes it distinct from first and second line reporting. So clearly, I think as a member of the board, you would be looking for that independent assurance, and therefore the ability of your third line of defence to provide you with that independent assurance will be, I think you would see something that's vital for you having confidence in your own ability to make the attestation to the FCA on an annual basis. I think, we've seen for any major type of change within an organisation, be it system changes or other types of regulatory change initiative, there's always a very clear role for internal audit in terms of providing assurance to both management and the board that those programs are being designed and run effectively. And this is just as true for consumer duty as with any other sort of previous change initiative that organisations have had to go through. I think where Matt touched on where the FCA has given feedback about what they've seen from the initial plans that boards have signed off on, And obviously, you'd expect they've given examples of good practice, but other areas where they think firms could do better. And it's interesting that although I think in our experience, we are aware that many internal audit functions or third line providers have been involved in the implementation programs to this point. Sometimes the feedback from the FCA was that the sign off from third line or perhaps even second line was not that transparent. So although there were plans, the board was signing off on those, it wasn't necessarily always apparent where the assurance that the board had received had come from. So I think that's something that people would need to bear in mind going forward, to say that, well, there needs to be perhaps greater transparency in the roles of first, second, and third line in the work they're performing to provide assurance to the board, as part of their annual attestation process. I think and that's something that we talk about, the implementation deadline of being July, and then the first annual attestation won't be until 2024. But I think it's important that organisations think about that process as soon as possible, because I don't see it as being an exercise where people will look to attain assurance at the end of that period. It's something that should be an ongoing process, and therefore third line needs to think about how it will provide that assurance and the activities it will be performing to be able to be in a position to give that come the deadline to give that attestation in July of 2024.
Yeah, thank you. And that's an interesting segue, I think, into essentially the question that I was going to follow up with, which was, you've alluded to the fact there that third line need to just start doing a little bit of thinking themselves. So it'd be interesting to follow on that conversation naturally. How should third line functions be considering, the impact of the consumer duty on their own approach to actually offering independent assurance? What sort of things are they going to need to think about? What are they going to need to change? What are they going to need to do?
Yeah, I think there'll be a combination of activities that third line will be performing. There'll be things specifically relating to the assurance they're providing over the consumer duty change programs or initiatives at different organisations, and so therefore that will be like, how are they engaged with those projects? What is their approach to providing assurance over them? There'll be things they'll probably have already looked at in terms of perhaps the initial gap analysis that organisations have been performed. Are already able to come up with a view as to whether that's been performed effectively. Has the initial interpretation of the requirements been done appropriately with the right use of subject matter expertise where relevant? So there will be those elements of how they provide assurance over the programme as a whole. But then I think one of perhaps the more fundamental shifts in approach to for internal audit as a result of the implementation of consumer duty will be in relation to consideration of consumer outcomes, which is really the focus of the whole the real focus for the change in the regulations around consumer duties, having a much more focus on outcomes rather than simple compliance with existing policies procedures. So I think that will extend to all the work that internal audit performs within an organisation. So they'll perhaps going to want to consider, for all of the work on their audit plan, what consideration is given within those audits to consumer outcomes, and is that something that's explicitly recognised in the scope for individual audits, or will there be separate audits focusing more generally on consumer outcomes across a number of different activities and areas? So it may be that they look to develop more of a matrix approach, whereby individual audits might focus on specific areas, but as one of the considerations for individual areas, they'll be thinking about, well, what does this tell us about customer outcomes, and therefore the application of the consumer duty principles. I think where there has been there's perhaps been a traditional focus for internal audit on testing of key controls, key processes, and in some ways that mirrors what the FCA is perhaps seen as a weakness, because there hasn't been sufficient focus on consumer outcomes, and therefore there is perhaps a remaining tendency for customers to experience poor outcomes, even where it can perhaps be shown that processes and policies are being followed. So It's around changes to their approach, but also ensuring that they have the right skills and capabilities to form a view as to whether customer outcomes are acceptable in perhaps sort of areas which haven't necessarily been something that areas that audit focused on so much. So things like foreseeability, the price value assessment, those areas of consideration for consumer duty where perhaps there hasn't been such a focus within internal audit work to date, but it's thinking about have they got the right capabilities, or how can they change the business in terms of how their business are making their own assessment in those areas.
Yeah, you can certainly see that with foreseeability, can't you? It's a fairly new concept being introduced, I think, into financial services regulation. I mean, there's always been the legal concept of foreseeability, but again, speaking from my own experience as kind of an ex-conduct and compliance auditor in the past, that wasn't necessarily something we would factor into our thinking when we were doing an audit. So I think as an internal audit colleague, I would want some training on that, and probably some structure put around how we might approach it in the future.
Yes, I think absolutely. I think there are a number of areas where firms themselves will need to look at what capabilities they have, and then equally, what can an internal audit do in terms of understanding the challenges around assessing those individual components in that way. So that's the ability then of firms to compare themselves with others, with other peers, and the conversations that have across different industry forums, for instance, are they engaged in those conversations to get an assessment of what other firms are doing, what things like the feedback from the FCA, are they getting an adequate understanding of that, and then that will inform their direction of travel.
And of course, one of the other big changes under consumer duty, which I think, by all means, correct me if you have a differing view, but I think sometimes perhaps all internal audit teams have difficulty with incorporating into their work, is how do we assess culture? And ultimately the foundation of this change by the regulator is making sure that thinking and approach to working changes, e.g. the culture at firms. I mean, I've seen something in the past called a management control assessment, which was an attempt by an internal audit at a bank to assess the attitude and approach taken by management to the internal control and risk management process. And from that, they could infer, I guess, they could infer attitude and approach and the culture within that particular business unit or area. For instance, look at how management address known control deficiencies, their regular assessment of controls, and actually how they've self-identified issues to internal audit that the internal audit then sort of confirm is something that perhaps needs a bit of work. I suppose my broader question here is, culture is very much part of this now. How can internal audit teams start to build culture into their audits? How do you go about something that's actually quite intangible to some people?
Yeah, I think internal audit, considering culture within organisations isn't something new, but it's something that there are still challenges around. There are a variety of different approaches, and it's not a sort of one size fits all solution to that. I think you've touched on certain things. So within any audits in any area, there will often be a consideration, as you say, about what is evident about management's attitude to risk and managing risks within their area. Are they forthcoming? Do they exhibit the right sort of characteristics in terms of being transparent if there are issues? Can they demonstrate that they are taking actions to address known issues? So those are certain things that you can build into any audit. But then you can also look at culture in an organisation from a specific lens, looking at it holistically across different parts of the organisation. Is there evidence that there is an attempt to create a clear culture within an organisation? How are those messages around culture communicated? And are there real tangible actions being taken by senior management to set the right tone at the top and cascade those behaviours and the right culture across the organisation? And I think you're right, that's it will play an important part in demonstrating that the principles of consumer duty are being recognised by the firm, because as we've touched on previously, it's not just a case of saying, well, we have a process, we're following that process. It's taking that much more holistic view to say, well, are we doing the right things across the board to ensure as far as possible that we have the right outcomes? It's moving away from that compliance approach to having specific policies, procedures which you can demonstrate you're following, really to sort of almost like take a more grown-up view by demonstrating that you have the right culture within an organisation. You are really showing that actually it's really the consideration of consumer outcomes is really at the heart of what you do.
And I know the FCA said previously that it considers the drivers of culture to be, or it breaks it down into 4 areas: leadership, purpose, reward and management of people, and governance. I mean, again, my experience is a lot of internal audits will certainly look at the governance aspects. They wouldn't necessarily, in my view, touch so much on how leadership is being conducted or how the actions and behaviours of staff in the firm align with the company's purpose. But would you agree, or do you think, again, that's something that is starting to be thought about and built in?
I think that it is certainly being thought about more because it is recognised that it is an area of focus. So organisations are actually, there is perhaps a view that, well, we'll arrive at the right culture by doing the right thing but without thinking about, well, actually, how are you going to demonstrate you're doing that? So by actually putting in some things more tangible about how you demonstrate things, I think it does help drive specific behaviours which will enforce and promote the right culture and the right behaviours within organisations.
Good. No, thank you. I mean, just going back to something we mentioned 3 or 4 minutes ago, which was, thinking about customer outcomes, which is very much at the heart of the consumer duty. And I think we're all agreed that, all 3 lines of defence, where they exist within a firm, will need to have a lot more focus on customer outcomes than they ever did in the past, much less on considering whether processes and procedures have been followed and more on actually what was the end result for our customer. But I think some other industry participants that I talk to still say they struggle to understand what is meant by assessing a customer outcome and what that perhaps involves, realistically. Can you maybe expand a bit more on the concept of customer outcomes and how an internal audit team or indeed an external audit consultant may go about assessing that?
Yeah, I mean, consumer, as we said, it's less about have we followed the process correctly and more about what did the end consumer experience and can we evidence that? So I think, it again, it's changing that mindset, and firms being able to put themselves in the customer's shoes is a crucial component of the consumer duty. And so an internal audit therefore need to, also understand that principle, and that will help, drive the nature of the work they do to sort of provide assurance that consumer duty is being implemented and maintained within organisations. The customer outcomes, it's not a new concept, but the FCA has used this as an opportunity to sort of shift the mindset away from that adherence to rules and policies, and really firms then have to think about how they will demonstrate that they are looking at customer outcomes. What is their approach to testing and monitoring, rather than being able to sort of simply sign off on individual controls? It is what will their approach be to measuring, assessing, and using the results of that assessment to feed back into how they further enhance their policies, procedures, and the way they operate. I think, in terms of outcome testing, I think perhaps traditionally it's not an area where internal audit themselves have provided so much focus. I think in part, that reflects the way organisations themselves have not necessarily looked at things in terms of compliance from an outcomes point of view. It's been more down the route of individual policies, procedures, and demonstrating that they're being adhered to. But even within the world of internal audit, the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors, in their Financial Services Code of Best Practice, they talk about the scope of internal audit activity should very much look at outcomes as well. It's not an area that was put in specifically in relation to consumer duty, but it does sort of strike as more relevant at this time with the introduction of consumer duty. So I think that just emphasises the importance of outcomes testing in terms of demonstrating for organisations that they're complying with the requirements of consumer duty, but also how all of internal audit needs to think about the assurance that they can provide around adherence to and compliance with consumer duty. Organised first and second line functions within organisations, they will need to develop and refine their own approaches to measuring customer outcomes, and therefore, audit needs to be able to provide assurance over the effectiveness of those processes. So I think there are different approaches. I mean, audit functions will need to determine what testing they will perform independently, looking specifically at outcomes. How much of that will they do? How much will they be perhaps testing the approaches that have been implemented by first and second line, for instance? So, but in either approach, it's important that internal audit has the capability to make the right judgments around what are good or acceptable outcomes. So, even if they aren't undertaking wholesale retesting of outcomes themselves, they still need to be able to provide the right level of challenge to first and second line management in the work that they're doing around outcomes testing.
Absolutely. And I guess one of the challenges for first and second line at the moment is actually coming up with what they think good outcomes look like, so they can start to structure their policies, processes and procedures around that. I guess there's an exercise there almost for internal audit to look at those outcomes holistically in their own right and decide whether they feel like the right outcomes and whether there are, for instance, enough of them to cover a particular topic or conduct area. It's an interesting area. I think it's evolving as well. Interesting to see what we get over the coming kind of months and years, as I'm sure the FCA will continue to do more follow-up work once the duty comes into effect. Before we go, Paul, one other area that the FCA has been talking more and more about over the last few years through various policy statements and initiatives is the concept of sludge practices, essentially culminating in the consumer duty policy, which will require firms to play a more active role in considering what I think I'd call choice architecture that they place before customers. Does customer outcomes perhaps overlap a little bit with the concept of sludge practices, and is again a place there for audit to help with that?
Yes, I think absolutely. I think recognising sludge practices is an example of perhaps something that wouldn't have been borne out by traditional approaches to audit testing, where you're looking at individual policies, procedures. But I think recognising where sludge practices are happening, that would very much help to demonstrate that actually the outcomes, customer outcomes on occasions where they are affected by sludge practices, that demonstrates that there aren't the sort of outcomes that the FCA and the boards of organisations should themselves be looking for. I think there are challenges though in terms of how those sludge practices can be recognised. I think on the one extreme, I think there are some obviously very poor practices where firms deliberately implement processes or systems or procedures whereby it makes it very difficult for customers, as an example, to exit and move their customer elsewhere. And I think we've all perhaps experienced those to some degree, where the frustration of sitting on a call centre line without seeing any obvious alternative in terms of how you can progress with your query or your request to take your customer elsewhere. So I think one of the challenges though is when you look at organisations and the way the customer journey works across many organisations, many organisations, it can become incredibly complex. So it's actually becoming arguably more difficult to recognise what the true customer journey is, and therefore be able to recognise the various points of customer interaction that you need to assess in coming up with a full view of the overall customer outcome for any individual. I think that's where one thing that will be increasingly important is the use of greater use of data and analytics to really recognise that customer path. I think the traditional approach of looking at policies, procedures, developing process maps, those were used to try and identify what the customer journey, what the customer path was. But I think increasingly, as organisations develop more complex systems and processes, very often that intended path for the customer journey may not always be followed, and you might find that because of various changes or simply because the process wasn't working as intended, the actual customer path is very different to that was intended, and that might be a way of recognising where there is an element of a sludge practice or some negative friction point that's been introduced into the customer journey, which, if recognised, can be acted on, and therefore can help achieve a better outcome for individual customers. So I think that's perhaps not something exclusively for third line, but I think it is a tool that we're seeing third line organisations put in place to assess the effectiveness of processes, and I see this as a good application for it in terms of recognising those points of negative friction which can contribute to the overall customer outcome.
And I guess going back to a point we made earlier on customer outcomes, for some internal audit teams, I guess there will be some upskilling required and adjustments to existing methodologies to build this in as part of the outcomes testing, for colleagues to understand, well, actually, how do we map this out? What does it look like in reality? What sort of questions should we be asking the business or the line that we're auditing to understand actually what does the journey look like from end to end?
Yes, absolutely. That the ability for an audit function to be able to recognise that, or again, are the first and second line putting in effective processes or controls, and that might form part of the initial discovery program that organisations are going through currently, in terms of, if they're trying to demonstrate that they are achieving adequate customer outcomes, do they have a good enough understanding of what the current customer journey is? And that's an example where, not just within third line, using those sort of tools and analytic capabilities within first and second line, I think will become increasingly important for firms to be able to evidence that they are, putting all they can into achieving the right outcomes.
Are you seeing this becoming a theme since consumer duty policy has been launched with those clients that are coming to us at Kroll for perhaps support with external auditing services? Is this something that they are asking about or mentioning?
Yes,
I'm wondering if we can help to understand.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think we are seeing firms come to us in terms of helping them to implement their response to consumer duty, but also provide assurance and benchmarking as well, to say, well, this is our interpretation of it. This is how we're looking to meet the requirements. Where does that stand compared with our peers? So I think that's always something of valuable to organisations. They can see that are they following the right sort of approaches? Are there things that are clearly missing, or are there other areas that firms have been implementing which could be of value to them as well? So it's not, again, to say you must all follow the same approach, but I think organisations are always looking for assurance that what other organisations are doing isn't too far away from their own approach, just because they don't want to be seen to have missed left gaps in terms of their approach, which other organisations haven't done, and that would obviously leave them as an outlier and viewed poorly, I think, by their own boards and the FCA as well.
Lovely. Look, thank you, Paul. It's thanks for joining me today. I know you're a busy man. That was very interesting to get an internal audit view. Again, reaching back to the comments we made near the beginning, it's very clear from the FCA that, if not already being done so, firms need to bring in their internal audit colleagues and risk colleagues very much to the table. So I think to hear from somebody who's got some third line experience on your interpretations, that's going to be useful for a lot of our listeners. So your insight's been valuable. I think what I would take away from our discussion is broadly that third line plays a key role in helping to embed the consumer duty within a firm's business. Assurance shouldn't just be restricted to one-off exercises, either now or when we enter a business as usual state after July 2023 for some firms. Although there will be some challenges, I think, for the third lines themselves to manage, as you've alluded to, in particular ensuring audit plans are adapted if necessary to consider the milestones on the horizon, and the upskilling of third line teams to ensure they have the ability to successfully assess customer outcomes in the months and years ahead.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, it is there's obviously a focus on the actual implementation program itself, but it should achieve a long-term change in mindset, principally around the focus on outcomes. And that's something that I think will be built longer term into the way that internal audit operates in organisations going forward.
Lovely, thank you. So for those listening, thank you for joining us. Please do subscribe to future episodes, share them across your professional network, and rate and review our series as it helps others using your chosen platform to find and utilise our podcasts. If you would like to hear more from us, please look out for our regular insight articles on our website, where you can also find details of how to contact us if you wish to discuss anything you've heard here today. We will be back in the near future, so from myself and Paul, thank you and goodbye.
Kroll's regulatory advice and consulting specialists provide insight on regulatory change approaching the financial services industry and discuss the FCA's intention to place clear accountability for compliant implementation of the consumer duty. Check out our featured insights by clicking on the link in the description.